YouTube, so I gotta apologize, it's been a while since I've made a video. I want to continue with my responses to Bill Nye's new series, and this particular episode that I want to respond to is Bill Nye's episode on... Excuse me, sorry about that, there's a few mosquitoes out here. I want to respond to Bill Nye's new episode on overpopulation. Now, when I watched this episode, I was... initially I was like, okay, there's, a lot here. Didn't think there was a whole lot that I'd be disagreeing on until I started really looking at his logic and really breaking things down and also doing a little background research. And I think that's important because even if you don't believe the Bible, there's a verse in Proverbs that says, "The first to present his case seems right until another comes forward and questions him." That's why in a court of law, you have it where you have two lawyers. You have both the prosecuting attorney and the defense lawyer. In systems of law where you're only allowed to have a prosecuting attorney and not allowed to have a defense attorney, it's obviously very barbaric, very savage, and that's why we have it where in this country where you have lawyers that can present both views, both arguing that the person is guilty and arguing that the person is innocent or not guilty, whichever legalese term you decide to use. But with coming back around to Bill Nye, watching this episode, it seemed very credible at first, seemed like there may be a few points I disagreed with, but then when I looked into it further, I realized a lot of the flaws, and that's why you don't just take everything at face value and say, well, that makes sense, I agree with that. Just because something makes sense doesn't mean you should agree with it. You should really look into things further. And so, with overpopulation, Bill Nye uses the analogy of sponge people in a kiddie pool. So he has a tiny kiddie pool filled with a finite amount of water, and he uses the analogy of, hey, there's all these sponge people here, and they're absorbing the water, and we only have a finite amount of water that they can absorb. And this water is meant to represent the finite amount of resources that the planet can offer. So Bill Nye's argument is, hey, there's only so many resources on the planet, it's static, and we keep getting more and more people and not enough resources to go around. The problem with Bill Nye's argument is that it's just plain wrong. So first off, he's saying, okay, we have a finite amount of resources. Not to mix metaphors, but you have a pie that's one size. We have one pie, and it's never getting any bigger. The kiddie pool is never getting more water in it. The kiddie pool is never growing. It's just a finite amount of resources, and the population is just skyrocketing. And if we don't stop it, then everybody's going to live in extreme poverty. It's going to be a disaster, and people are going to keep having, 10 kids per couple, and, things are going to be bad. And, of course, 10 kids per couple might be a bit of an exaggeration. I don't want to be accused of straw manning here. But, this is the argument of overpopulation, is just we're going to keep having babies until we can't possibly sustain any more human beings. Now, there's so many problems with this argument. Like I said, this argument is just plain wrong. If you look at the history of science and innovation, if you look at the way things were 100 years ago, they're not the way they are today. In fact, people in 2017 are living better than they ever have in the history of the world, on average. Yes, there are cases of extreme poverty, but overall, the percentage of people in the world living in extreme poverty is actually going down. And the absolute number of people in extreme poverty has actually started going down as well. So, this idea that you only have X number of resources and that's it, and you just have to divide X by the amount of the population is, completely absurd. For quite a number of reasons. You just look at the advances made by genetic engineering, for example. We're able to provide more food for people than ever before. You look at the better farm equipment. We're able to provide more food for people than ever before. So farming has grown tremendously, in human history. so that we no longer have to have it where it used to be where the vast majority of people lived on farms and we had a completely agriculture-based society. That's no longer the case. I mean, the number of people who we need to work on farms is vanishingly small by comparison. So there's a lot that's wrong with the pool analogy. Now, obviously, we do have a finite planet, so eventually there is going to be a point where eventually you do have to say that, you know, all the science and innovation, you can only have so many people living on the planet. Granted. But I don't think we're near that point yet, based on the math. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute, but when we look at what capitalism alone has done in the past 100 years, it's raised so many people out of poverty. Capitalism, it's been said, has been the one economic force to raise people out of poverty more than anything else. And I know we live in a day and age where we have these special snowflakes who want to talk about how much they hate capitalism while they tweet it out on their iPhone drinking a Starbucks coffee. And obviously these are people who are virtue signaling. These are idiot college students who don't understand economics. But the reality of it, the objective reality, is that capitalism has raised so many people out of poverty. And it has led to so much innovation, so much science and technology that it's unbelievable. I mean, I'm able to film this on a smartphone. I mean, how crazy is that? I'm filming this on a smartphone made by LG, serviced by Verizon, and I'm going to upload this to YouTube. That's insane. These developments didn't come out of the Soviet Union. They didn't come out of communist China. They didn't come out of Cuba. I mean, sure, some of the stuff might have been made in China, but that's because China uses capitalism to help support the rest of their country so they don't collapse. If China was a pure socialist or pure communist country, they wouldn't be able to survive. They would have collapsed a long time ago, just like the Soviet Union did. Now, there's a lot that I could say here, but I think a lot of it's pretty obvious. People are living better today than they, have in the past, on average, like I said before. More and more resources are being created. So that pool of water that Bill Nye talked about, a better analogy would be to say, hey, maybe this was a cup of water 200 years ago, but because more people were born and more people were able to create innovation, now we have a small pond. If you're comparing this to a sponge people. So you have more resources per person now compared to history. Now, there are people out there, like, I actually had it where I was at work one time, my last job, and there were a couple people there talking about how cow farts are going to, cause the planet to increase its temperature by 2 degrees, and that's going to end the world. And maybe that's going to be a video for another time. But the reality is, it's not about the number of people versus the amount of resources. It's really about how those resources are used. The one person at work argued that, hey, if we only had 3 million people living on the planet, then we wouldn't be facing all these problems we're facing today. And I don't necessarily agree with that. We might be facing different problems from what we're facing now, but we'd still face problems. So it's not the size of the resources, it's how you use them. And for those who would say, well, if we had a smaller population size, we'd be having less of an impact on the environment, I think there's quite a number of species of extinct megafauna who might beg to differ. And I'll let that sink in for a moment. Look at the extinction of the woolly mammoth. Many have argued this was the result of mankind overhunting. Several other species of megafauna that existed towards the end of the last ice age were around and are no longer around in a lot of thought is that it was due to man. So people back then were far fewer in number than they are today. But as we've, increased in size, we've increased in our ability to manage resources properly. We've developed nature preserves and things like that. We've developed a system where people can hunt animals in Africa on preserves, and then that money is then used to help preserve the animals. So you have somebody comes and shoots as Adam Ruins Everything pointed out, somebody comes and shoots a rhino that's violent, that's killing other rhinos. That rhino that they had to put down anyway, now they have $300,000 to help preserve the rhinos. And as a result, the rhino population has actually increased dramatically. So the bottom line is it's not about how much resources you have, it's about how you use them. Obviously, we live in a world where we do have cases of extreme poverty. And you look at places, especially like Africa is the place that comes to mind the most. Now, I hate being, the typical American guy who puts all of Africa together as if it were one giant country, because obviously it's not. But when you think extreme poverty, you think of Africa, India, China. And sorry guys, I'm getting eaten alive by mosquitoes here. India and China, their economies are growing thanks to capitalism. But you look at very impoverished places in Africa, what's the problem? Why are they so impoverished? Basically, it's corrupt government. And so it's like, if you really want to help bring people out of poverty, bring proper capitalism to those countries and get the government out of the way. A few other things I want to say about this particular episode. They talked about empowering women and that making it where women have fewer babies. Great. Fine. Yes, empower women. Make it where women can have more options in the third world especially. But one thing that really disappointed me about this episode is they don't address the upcoming population crash. And it made me ask, with this team that Bill Nye has, where their full-time job is putting together this TV show, do they not have Google? Do you not know about the population crash? It's projected that many countries around the world, and eventually the world as a whole, will be experiencing a population crash in the future. Why? Why do you say that? Well, Greg, the population is still increasing. Don't you know this? What are you talking about? Yes, the population is increasing, but it's increasing at a slower rate than it was before. And so what's going to happen is the population is going to gradually increase, and then it's going to reach a tipping point, and the population is going to start going down. Basically, as you bring innovation to countries, as you bring industrialization, people have fewer kids. In India, they used to have 6 kids per woman. Now it's down to 2.5. Now that's still decent. You can still maintain a culture, because of that. But as industrial evolution spreads in India, as more people are able to have fewer kids, you're going to start seeing a different story. Japan, Europe, and the USA are already projected to have population crashes in the near future. Japan especially, because people in Japan just aren't having sex, they aren't having babies, and it's a huge problem. So, what is the takeaway lesson with all of this? For those of you who are Christians, go out there and have babies. Go out there, get married, have children. And be able to support your children. Don't, ideally, I don't think any good person wants to live off the government. So, my heart goes out there if you're somebody who works really hard, but you still need to have EBT cards and stuff like that. I've been there. I've needed government assistance before too. But just so I don't bunny trail, go out there, get a good job, get a wife, have children. And raise up godly children. Teach them the right values. Teach them that the Word of God is true. And give them something good to live by. And you know what? For, those who hate human beings, hate society, you know, hate white people or hate black people or whatever, and you want X group of people to die, you know what, just don't have kids. Just go sit somewhere and just don't have kids. You know, you don't need to pass that on to the next generation. So that was way off topic, but, you know, there were a few other things that this video talked about. You know, they talked about population equals climate change, and maybe that's something I'll address in a different video, but, you know, for crying out loud, if we were using nuclear power, things wouldn't be a problem. And so, I think I'll actually do a follow-up video to this one, but thank you for watching this video. This is Greg, out.